Hello and welcome to another episode of Words with Friends. In this season, we explore some big conversations. We get deep and we look to be able to understand and ask some of the questions that perhaps you should have been asking yourself, haven't been asking yourselves, and perhaps we can provide some answers and some clarity around topics that you've been exploring in your own mind. For this week, I've got a brilliant guest for you. Somebody I've got to know over the last few years, who's a speaker, an author, a creativity evangelist, and just a brilliant human. So welcome to the show, Denise Jacobs.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. Appreciate it.
So good to have you here, Denise. And I see you're there in sunny Florida right now, enjoying some sunshine, hopefully safe and well. And Denise, typically on Words with Friends in previous episodes, my guests haven't got to know their word until the very moment of the show. And I told you ahead of time, I've been telling everybody in this season ahead of time, so that what you can do is start to wrap some of your thoughts around it. You do a huge amount of work in the area of creativity, but also one of your most famous published pieces of work is a book called Banish the Inner Critic. I've had the ability to be able to experience your work around that book. I've been in the audience of some of your programs and really enjoyed the both thinking and the workshops that you run around that work, helping other people to be able to banish their inner critic. Yeah. And it made me think, what word would I like to choose to discuss with Denise here today? And the word that I've chosen for us to discuss is the word criticism, which I think is kind of a big deal. It's something many of us are fearful of. It's something many of us live in hate of. It's something that many of us are cruel to ourselves with. But I also think it's something that exists a lot in others. Why do you think that I would like to be able to talk about criticism specifically with you?
Well, in light of all the things that are happening at this very moment with the rise of the anti-racism movement, Black Lives Matter, that criticism is something that I think is really prevalent right now, that there's a lot of criticism of how people are showing up. A lot of people are actually, there's a lot of self-criticism, so that not so much the questions, but the issues that are coming up, and it's just making people do a lot of self-reflection, doing a lot of self-examination, a lot of soul-searching, and in a lot of ways, I think that people are criticizing themselves about what they've done in the past and how they've shown up. And so I think criticism is a really relevant word and a really relevant issue right now. And I know for myself, just dealing with my own audience, that people's self-criticism, people's inner critics have been having a field day. Lots of rife fodder to work with. And so I think part of what needs to happen moving forward is, I think the more people are able to recognize the internal criticisms that they have, and then also be able to manage the external criticisms, kind of like the better off we're going to be. I'm sure
okay.
About that.
Yeah, I certainly don't disagree with that comment. And what I'm seeing a lot of right now in both the media, from political leaders, from my next door neighbors, from members of my family, is lots of outward criticism towards what somebody, anybody, everybody else is doing. There's this natural feeling of being able to say, well, I'm going to look at everybody else's actions and I'm going to pass judgment on it, and I'm going to do that judgment in the form of criticism. Why do you think the natural reaction for many is to criticize first?
I think, well, to criticize other people, and I think it's because it's a lot easier to look at other people's problems, or what you perceive to be other people's problems, and to look at that and to criticize it, than to look inward and to look at yourself and to do soul searching. And so I think it's, in some ways, it's almost like it's a crutch, right? Like it's much easier to point the finger than to turn around and say, wait a minute, why do I, and even also to not examine your beliefs, right? I mean, this is what's happening too, is that people are having these deep set very old beliefs that are being shaken to the core, and they're not questioning it. They're like, well, no, but that's how I was raised. That's what I learned. That's what my parents taught me. Instead of saying, well, but your parents are humans, and or the environment that you're in are people who make mistakes, who maybe don't teach exactly the thing that's helpful, right? And so it's way easier to turn around, because then that makes you question everything about your life. It's much easier to turn around and to point the finger and say they're doing it wrong and they were doing it wrong, and they shouldn't do that, and why are they doing this, and why they're hurting themselves. It just doesn't make any sense, right? Instead of saying, why have I shown up in this way, and what's contributed to me seeing the world the way I do. And some people have the luxury of doing that, and some people don't.
Yeah. In our world of speaking and in performing in front of others, there's a phrase that gets used a lot, and I know it exists within Michael and Amy Port's work at Heroic Public Speaking, where they make it very clear that you can be a performer or a critic, you can't be both. What is your viewpoint on that kind of statement?
Well, I mean, that actually relates a lot to the work that I do on creativity. And it's kind of a similar thing where I'm saying you can't be creative if your inner critic is present. You can't be creative and be self-critical or be critical of your work at the same time. And that's really exactly what they're saying. You can't perform, you can't express and be creative and criticize yourself while you're doing it, because that literally actually stops the process. And there's been wonderful research, scientific research. Charles Lim did a TED talk called Your Brain on Improvisation. And what he did was he took improvisational artists, he put them like musicians and also hip hop artists, put them in an MRI machine and scanned their brains while they were doing musical improv, while they were doing improvisational jazz, or while they were doing hip hop, like rhyming. And it showed that the prefrontal cortex, part of your brain that's in charge of behavior modification and self-judgment and things like that, that part of your brain actually is not active when you're improvising and when you're being creative and when you're letting that stuff flow. Same thing, if you're acting or if you're performing, if on stage as a speaker or as an actor or whatever, improv person, you have to be able to access that part of you where all of those ideas are, where all that flow is. And you can't get to that when you're being self-judgmental and you're trying to modify your behavior. And so the critic can't be present when you're trying to do stuff. And I feel like in a lot of ways, kind of relating to what's happening now, the same kind of thing. If you're trying to take in new information, if you're trying to envision what the world could be in the future moving forward, if you're trying to recreate yourself into a different person or into a better version of yourself, that criticism, that is going to get in the way of that creation process and that development process and that growth process.
So if you're criticizing other groups of people, you're criticizing your leadership, you're criticizing people within your communities, what you're actually doing is sabotaging yourself to be able to perform at a level of peak within your own relationships, within your own organizations, with the things that actually matter to yourself, because what you're doing is that you're not actually allowing your brain to support the cognitive function of growth.
Amen, brother. That's it.
So criticism in its very nature is an enemy of growth.
I actually, I never connected those dots in that way, but yeah, I would actually.
You just gave it to me, girl. You just gave it to me.
I'm just saying, I never actually had a conversation about this to this degree, but yeah, I would argue that that's really true.
Well, that's what I'm learning from listening to you right now. And There is so much criticism in this world right now from every angle. And yes, we're seeing it show up a huge amount around this race issue, which is very, very much an issue. And people are criticizing the way it's being dealt with. They're criticizing what celebrities are deciding to be able to post about it. They're criticizing brands for getting something slightly wrong. And there is so much fear of criticism that the result of which, I think for many, is that they choose to say nothing, do nothing, or act in no way whatsoever. What would you say to people who are thinking that I'm so fearful of criticism that I'm going to do nothing?
But then that also means that you're not growing, right? Because when you're it's almost like you're shielding. So I wanted to say, kind of back to what I was saying before, just to touch upon it, that this outward criticism of everything is deflection, right? Okay. It's deflecting away from, I mean, that's the word that came to me, is it's deflecting like all of this, again, turning into yourself and looking at yourself and examining your own position and, you know, what's going on with you. And then the shielding of, you know, like, well, I'm just gonna I'm just not gonna do anything. And actually we can kind of take it down to an evolutionary or, you know, kind of a biological thing. What happens when you become afraid, you go into fight, flight, or freeze mode, right? And so This is, some people are in fight and some people are in flight and some people are in freeze. But freezing sometimes works to protect you from enemies or to protect you from predators, and sometimes it doesn't. And even when, just from a standpoint, from a biological standpoint, when animals do go into freeze, typically afterwards, once the threat is gone, I find this really interesting because this actually works with humans. I mean, it's very related both with humans as well. Then they actually will often get up and like have like this like huge nervous response because they've been frozen for so long, and then their nervous systems will like actually spasm for a while, and then they reset, and then they get back to normal. So just taking that into consideration, freezing is not going to necessarily keep you safe. You're still going to have after effects and shocks from it, right? So yeah, I people are so afraid, but I feel like that prevents you from the growth. I mean, the goal here, I feel like, and one of the things that I've been kind of, you know, concerned with, just almost as a rhetorical question, is when are we going to evolve as humans? Like, we've got everything that we need. We're enamored with technology, some of which I don't know necessarily is actually serving us well. We've got, you know, we think we know so much and all of this stuff, and yet we're still acting like barbarians, for lack of a better term. We're still acting like we're not so far. We're still fighting all the time over ridiculous things, right? We're still like engaging in just this like really kind of like basic behavior where we have like all these things, all this knowledge at our behest that we could be using to actually like evolve and elevate ourselves into the next iteration of how great humans could possibly be. And why aren't we doing that? And I feel like this is a time where we have the opportunity to actually elevate ourselves, elevate our consciousness, become better humans, to human better.
So let's play with this some further. Criticism, if somebody is criticizing, is that a sign of a strength or a sign of a weakness, in your opinion?
I'd say that it is a sign of a weakness, more so. I mean, and to some degree, like, here's the thing. There are some things where you need to point out that there are issues. Absolutely. Yep. Right? I'm not going to act like there's no, like, oh, everybody should just, I'm not a laissez-faire person. This is not like everybody should just be able to do their own thing and all of this stuff. I don't think that's true. I think, like with the whole issue of police brutality, it needs to be criticized. It needs to come, these issues need to come to light. Now,
and I don't even know if that's criticism, Denise. I think that's saying that it needs a response. It's saying that actually we're not criticizing the level of performance. We're fundamentally saying that is wrong. Right. We're not saying this is how you're doing it. We're just saying, that is a response rather than a criticism, right? It is. You can criticize how somebody's doing something, but you can't criticize whether they should be doing it at all.
Mm-hmm. So,
and criticism for me is staying very much in that lane of, this is a judgment to the how, right? This is a judgment to the actions that are being done in terms of the way in which they're being delivered, as opposed to should they or shouldn't they be. And I think this judgment towards other people's actions, thoughts, and behaviors, I agree with you entirely, is a sign of weakness. Yet what's interesting as we talk this through, and you've just made me think of something, is when somebody criticizes, our natural reaction is to defend or attack that criticism. But if we're seeing that criticism as a sign of weakness as opposed to a sign of strength, would you attack somebody that you naturally was now looking at demonstrating a sign of weakness? Or would you respond differently if you could identify criticism as a sign of weakness as opposed to an attack on you?
Yeah.
I don't know the answer to that. I'm just thinking of it right now as we are talking this through.
And that's really interesting. I mean, and in a lot of ways, if you think about it, and I've actually put quite a bit of thought to this, or, at least some, is that in a lot of ways, racism, or some of the narrative, or some of the mythology around how Black people, for example, are lesser than white people as part of this thing. Part of this comes from not strength, but comes from weakness, that comes from fear, that comes from, like, why don't we make it so that the narrative is that they're, uncivilized and on this and not that and not that, but it's because we're afraid of them, or we're weaker. And so we're going to create this.
You have to suppress.
Right.
Okay.
And so that, I think, is, in a lot of ways, it's really telling. I mean, that the police, just thinking about like the long litany of people over the last however many years have been the victims of police brutality. And you're just like, you're going to shoot a 12-year-old boy who has a toy gun on a playground, right? Like, you're going to go into a woman's apartment who's not even part, like the perpetrator that you're looking for isn't even anywhere near there, and you're going to run into her apartment shooting. Like, how is that coming from a place of strength?
It has to be coming from an insecurity, some form of fear, some form of weakness somewhere that says, I'm so scared I'm going to react irresponsibly, irrationally, because I don't have the maturity to be able to see the situation for what it is.
Yeah. One of the stories that I feel like has been really interesting that people haven't been mentioning it, probably because the child didn't get killed, but earlier this year in January, apparently there was a little girl who had a temper tantrum at school, and they called the police on her and she got arrested. She was 6 years old. A 6-year-old girl has a temper tantrum at school. They call the police on her and she gets arrested. And this is all captured with the police cam, with all of it.
Wow.
How can you arrest a 6-year-old child having a tantrum? How could the principal or the assistant principal say, I was afraid for my safety from a 6-year-old child. I mean, so stuff like that, it's startling then, like how deeply ingrained this fear is that it even gets projected onto children. I mean, it's amazing. It's amazing. So
yeah, it's tough. And I think that point you make about the narrative that sits around things is so huge. There's an exercise that you do in one of your programs.
mm-hmm.
And I still remember almost the skin tingling moment that came as a result of this piece in one of your programs. And it's when you ask us as an audience to close our eyes
Mm-hmm.
and to no longer judge things in what we see. And then you invite other members of the audience and strangers to come and whisper things in our ears, right?
Yeah.
And you know this part of your programs. And I remember strangers coming up with a high level of intimacy and sharing compliments and messages of gratitude, etc., up close and personal, right into your ear. And the difference that would make to how you feel and how you would act and then what you would go on to be able to do. Now, the context of that session was very much about how we talk to ourselves.
Right.
And I think we'll get to that shortly. But that noise, that chatter is around all of us in some way, right? Whether that's our social media feed, whether that's our family around the dining room table, whether that's 100 years of heritage through what a family name might mean, whether that is, the social circuit of the people that you hang out with, is we are experiencing an echo chamber of noise in some way, shape, or form. And in that example of your work, I got to experience the very real life difference between me feeling amazing or me feeling less than amazing because of what other people were saying.
Yes, absolutely.
And that was a safe place.
It was.
What do we need to do to firstly, A, make the world more of a safe place? And then also, what is the conversation that we should be whispering in people's ears, hypothetically,
mm-hmm.
that replaces the criticism that is showing up right now?
Oh, gosh. One of the things that's nice, and one of the things that I'm seeing, and I'm very much hoping that this isn't just a flash in the pan and it's going to happen for, a few weeks or a couple of months or whatever, and then people are going to be distracted by something else, which I'm sure it's probably going to happen, but let's hope that there's some longevity to this. But that people are starting to say different things, right? That the echo chamber is changing, and that there is more of a celebration of different people starting to, or at least an acknowledgement of different people. People like yourselves are making their platforms available to amplify voices that haven't had as much of a venue, or haven't had as much of as far reach. And so I think it's a matter of it. I mean, kind of in the same way of this exercise, where you needed to tell people what you wanted to hear yourself. Mm-hmm. And pretty much everybody wants to hear that they're okay, right? Everybody wants to hear that they're okay. Everybody wants to hear that they're doing a good job. Everybody wants to hear, I see you and I value you. Everybody wants to hear that. So why not just keep saying that? Why not keep doing that?
So the echo chamber is less of a what about me, and more of a what about you in every area of life, right? I know we have this miss where some people haven't quite understood the reason why it's Black Lives Matter and not All Lives Matter. And in the first part of this series, then Tony does a good job of helping people understand the difference between the two. I think the goal is to get to a position where everybody on the planet can show up with grace and understanding and level the playing field for every human on there. Yet we need some acceptance right now that if there is a part of society that we can understand has been unfairly treated, then the goal is to say, what can we pour into that part of the echo chamber to say, what are we whispering into the ears of those people to say, okay, how do we make their inner voice start to be able to believe that they matter anymore? Because hang on, the reality as I see it is there is a belief that a giant part of our civilization believe that they don't matter to the same level of other people. Whether you believe they do or not is irrelevant. There is a giant part of civilization that believe they don't matter to the same level as others. That's the issue.
And because they have literally for hundreds of years been treated as such, because every single thing in their lives has shown them that's what's true. You don't matter as much, whether it's women, whether it's Black people, whether it's Jewish people, whether it's, Tibetans. Like, there are, you choose a place, choose a country, choose a time period, and there's somebody who's been persecuted. There's somebody who has been taken and marginalized. And we have to get to the point where we just realize that everybody is important. We're all here on the planet trying to do something good.
Right.
And we need to acknowledge people.
Denise, help us understand, if you can, through your lens, some of the specific criticism that you've received through your life.
Oh my gosh. Well, I wrote a post actually on Facebook. It's been interesting because it's been so subtle in some places, in terms of racial stuff, in terms of personal stuff, where sometimes now especially I feel like it's starting to be harder to distinguish the personal criticisms and distinguish them from whether or not they were regardless or irrespective of race. But in a lot of ways, I have actually personally worked so hard to be exemplary so that I could save myself from being criticized. Right? That I have worked really hard in school and tried to excel academically and tried to excel at everything I did so that I wouldn't get criticized, so that I wouldn't become a target in that respect. But, some of the criticisms that I've gotten have been that I'm too much, I'm too intense, too emotional, that I take things too personally. I've had people say that. I've had people, and then, that I remember very distinctly, I was telling a friend about a job I had. I was a contractor at Microsoft for about a year. And my first manager was great, and we got along wonderfully. And then apparently, according to her, I had done so well in that position that I got moved to another team to do a similar position, but like for a product that was a more more widely used product called Internet Server, Internet IIS. Anyway, my manager there was a white guy, and he didn't get me somehow or another. And so by the time, done the job at this point in time for probably about 6 months, and they put the job up as a full-time position. So in Microsoft, you've got orange badges, which are contractors, and blue badges, which are full-time folks. They turned it into a blue badge position. I was like, great, I'll apply for it. And I talked to my manager, and he was like, I don't think you're ready. And I was like, wait, I've been literally doing this job for 6 months. What do you mean you don't think I'm ready? Well, I don't think you're ready for the position. And I'm like, that's interesting. So they hire another woman, do an internal hire. She gets moved over from another position, and I have to train her. A white woman. She's actually German. Very, very nice. Really liked her. We got along great. We were having lunch one day and she was like, "Can I ask you a question?" And I was like, "Sure." And she was like, "Why don't you have this job? Like, you're training me on how to do everything. Why don't you have this position?" I was like, "Oh, Nick said I wasn't ready." And she was like, "Really?" And I was like, "Yeah." She was like, "Huh, okay." And I was like, "Yeah, interesting, isn't it?" So
We're dealing with this whole thing where you're saying that you've done everything you possibly can to avoid criticism to a point that you maybe haven't experienced a huge quantity of criticism, because where the opportunities could have arose, you maybe didn't step into them in the same way. So the question I want to ask you in the scenario that you just painted out, given that feedback from your coworker that you were training in that environment, what did you do about bringing that information to Nick in that moment?
You know what? I decided that, well, first of all, she had already been hired. And second of all, I never jibed with him. And it's one of the things that you also learn, I think, is to choose your battles. And
Yeah.
I was like, it wasn't like I wanted the position itself and that I loved it. It was project management. I literally hate project management. It's like, I was just like, why don't we do this? Why don't you get a stick and you can poke me in the eye with it instead of me doing project management? What I really wanted was I wanted to be full-time at Microsoft, because that would have given me job security that I was seeking, and financial security that I was seeking at the time. Plus, that was also when Microsoft stock was splitting like crazy, and it would have made me probably a millionaire. But so like I wasn't willing to fight for that position. And I also wasn't willing to try to fight somebody to have them see me clearly, because I also learned that when people have an opinion about you or have a perception about you, it takes a lot of work to try to change that. And sometimes it's not worth it.
How often does that show up in the workplace?
It shows up a lot at this point, because I work for myself. And that's part of, and I have to say it is actually a really large reason. That part of the impetus of me working for myself was like, I don't want to play any of the office politics. I don't want to have to be trying to convince people that I'm great when I am. I don't want to be pigeonholed into doing jobs that I've literally told you, like, I'm actually really good at this other job. Like, I would like to do this other job instead. Well, why don't you just get good at the project management thing? Then we'll let you be a trainer. You should let me be a trainer now, because I'm good at training. I just came from 5 years of teaching web design and web development at a community college. I'm already good at training. Like, and so I was like, I don't feel like trying to do all those things and jump through hoops and have people not see me anymore. If I just work for myself and I have the relationships, then people who I work with will work with me because they see me and they get me.
So the very reality of that I'm learning right now is a brand like Microsoft could have you as being a dedicated professional voice within their organization right now, helping steering the conversation at the leadership table, but instead they overlooked you at a time when they had the opportunity to hear you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because I wasn't, quote, ready, unquote, for, I don't even know what that even means.
Here's a question I'm very interested in. You've worked so hard to avoid criticism to a point that instead of getting toe-to-toe with criticism in a corporate ladder, you've defined your own career by carving something else for yourself. Now in a career where largely you make up all the rules, you made up the job description. In fact, you made up most of the things that you get paid for today. Like, that is your reality. And part of what you do is you stand on stage and you speak.
I do. That's so
and
wonderful.
Standing on stage and speaking is one of the most vulnerable experiences that anybody that could go through, that is without question going to result in criticism, whether that criticism is vocalized or whether that criticism exists in other people's biases. You know for certain it is happening. Why?
The only thing that I can say is I literally don't think about criticism necessarily when I'm going on stage until I eventually get it or don't get it. I feel so at home on stage. I love speaking so much that it doesn't matter to me what other people think. I mean, what matters to me is that I get my point across to people, that I'm helping people, that I'm teaching them, that I'm sharing something that could be valuable to them. And what also matters to me is that when I'm speaking and I'm in front of an audience and I'm connecting with them, I feel like I'm flying.
Well, you help other people fly while you're doing that work too. So that's the truth.
And it's one of the most satisfying things I've ever done in my whole entire life.
You're very good at it as well. I think it's okay to be emotional, right? Nothing wrong with that.
I forgot to give the disclaimer. I usually give the disclaimer, like, I'm probably going to get emotional. And people are like, oh.
Denise, this isn't the first time that you've cried in my presence. It's okay.
You just bring it up.
Let's just touch a little further on this.
Yeah.
Is when you speak on stage and that you've decided that you may or you may not get criticism, do you think you are treated and in turn criticized differently because of the fact that A, you're a woman, and B, the fact that you're a black woman? Do you think that creates a different level of judgment? And if so, tell us more.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And one of the things I was actually talking last night with a group of folks about this, that in a lot of ways, my content and how I present my content has been very much influenced by trying to prevent criticism. So I talk about creativity, but in a lot of ways, I started contextualizing it or having my spin on it be the neuroscience of creativity. Because creativity in and of itself is a subject matter that a lot of people can dismiss, could say that's not important, to say it's not relevant, and also can, like, potentially, depending on who's doing it or what, can kind of say, well, that's not founded on anything. And especially because I come from a tech background and the tech industry, and especially because I was working with people who were software engineers, developers, and everything, predominantly male and predominantly white, I didn't want to give anybody any kind of entree to be able to criticize the validity of what I was saying. And so I started to I was like, I find it interesting, I find it fascinating personally, but I also was like, first of all, it's going to probably be more relatable to this audience. And second of all, they can't refute what I'm saying because it's based in science. And so I
get that. And I challenge it a little in the fact that this is you building a suit of armor
mm-hmm.
before you put yourself on the battlefield,
mm-hmm.
because you've already predetermined and decided that there's a strong possibility that your methodology and your thoughts and your opinions are going to be shot down because of some prejudgment. Is that the truth?
That is the truth. And because I live in the world as a Black woman, I already know that there's going to be prejudgment. There's a fantastic article on white privilege written by a woman that's been around for several years. I read it back in 2016, but it's now making its circulation again. And I can't remember the woman's name who wrote it, but it's a fantastic article. And she talks about how she went to Harvard for her undergraduate and went to the post office, a guy, white kid in front of her, mailing off stuff to Harvard, and the post office worker was like, oh my God, congratulations, that's so wonderful, blah, 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 blah. Then she comes up to mail her stuff, and she's like, yeah, I'm gonna be going to Harvard too. And the woman was like, the one in Massachusetts?
I read this piece.
Right. I went to Stanford my first year. I can't tell you how many times I would say to people, they're like, oh, where are you going? And I'd say, I'm going to Stanford. And they say, Stamford? Because there's a school of college in Stamford, Connecticut, which I literally had never heard of. And I was like,
Right.
no, Stanford. And they're like, Stanford? No, I'm going to Stanford. And so I already know, having lived my whole life in this body, that there's going to be prejudgment, and you learn to armor yourself ahead of time. You learn to try to think ahead of stuff, so that, I mean, at least I did, because then I learned that maybe I could try to protect myself from potential things. I mean,
Yeah.
nothing could.
And
Nothing,
I get it. And it's your truth. It's your reality. And I fully appreciate why you do it. I just wish you didn't have to. And that's what I'm trying to explore in this moment in my mind right now is how does that rhetoric change? How does that start to move in a different direction? And there's two things here, right? Is strangely enough, the criticism that you've received off the platform after the fact, etc., is largely coming from the few people that are brave enough or weak enough to be able to bring you that criticism.
Yes, exactly. And then the other people who loved you
say nothing.
So I spoke at a really big conference back in 2017, right after my book came out. And they, you know, I sold the book afterwards and everything. And I was one of the few instances where I worked through a speakers bureau. There were 800 people in the audience, maybe 750, because, you know, everybody doesn't always show up. But there were 800 attendees at the conference, probably about 750 people in the audience for my keynote. I was one of 4 keynotes. I was the third keynote on the keynote on the third day. And then people gave feedback. Well, it seems like they got 43 people or 45 people who gave feedback, and 31 of those people was negative feedback. But the room had 750 people in it.
Right.
So what comes back to the Speakers Bureau is only the people who had enough of a bee in their bonnet to be upset about whatever. And then the other 700 people who were tweeting and saying, oh my God, this is amazing. And who came and stood in line for an hour, you know, a half an hour to come and buy my book. And they came up afterwards and was like, I was so happy you were here and all this stuff. None of those people gave feedback. Just the people who were like, well, she had too many slides. She talked
Yeah.
about she blah, blah, blah. And
the coffee was too cold, and that was your fault as the speaker.
It was my fault. Why didn't I have warmer coffee? And so I find it really interesting, like, and, you know, and that has, you know, stayed with me to today. And I was like, wow, like, where are all the people, like, the people who stood in line to get my book, who were writing, who took pictures with me? Like,
yeah. But I think people mistake the difference between feedback and criticism, right? Is they think feedback is permission for criticism. Mm-hmm. See, more often than not, when people are asking for feedback, what they're looking for is praise. And when people are asked to give feedback, they think it's permission to give criticism, right? That is what happens in typical sense of circumstances, regardless of color of someone's skin, sexuality, etc. Across the board, when people are asked to deliver feedback, they look for fault. Mm-hmm. And that is something I think as humans across the board that we need to consciously take a beat on and just say, hold on. Is this going to create the genuine outcome that we're looking to be able to go and achieve? What could we do instead? There's a big but in this, though, as well, because the injustice here is that even when you're receiving praise on your platform, there's a yeah, but.
Yeah.
Now, see, I've heard conversations where, like, oh, that was a really good speech for a woman.
Right. He says she's so smart for a Black girl. Or, like, if you hear this, you're so pretty. She's so pretty for a Black girl. Oh, thanks.
These are all the little things that the person saying it believes they're giving compliment when actually they are providing criticism.
Underhanded. Yep.
And I do believe sometimes, Denise, that it is done without a single ounce of malice. Doesn't mean that it's right,
Right.
but it wasn't intended to deliver the impact that it truly did.
Absolutely.
The only way I'm thinking that we resolve this, or certainly add contribution to it in the other direction, is we replace criticism with wholehearted praise.
Mm-hmm. And that's basically what you were saying earlier, right? How
Yeah.
can we change the echo chamber?
Yes, and I think that that's what we all have a collective responsibility to, that instead of looking for fault, is where can we look to amplify the good news? See, the media has done a good job of saying that criticism and chaos attacks the headlines. Therefore, people want to take actions that create more chaos and criticism.
Mm-hmm.
If we feed the good news the attention instead, then perhaps all of a sudden we make it sexier to say nice things about people rather than nasty things. That could be a wonderful world to live in. Maybe a little utopian, but I think I'd still like to shoot for it. So there are dozens of areas in life where our natural reaction is to jump to criticism. Where do we do it right now, Denise? So let's ignore the race issue. Let's ignore the big issue. Where are the little areas of our lives where our natural reaction is to pick the fault as opposed to praise the good?
I feel like it's everywhere, right? I mean, I have been party to so many conversations with people kind of as a consultant and as a coach. And almost every time somebody does something, they'll follow it up with a long list of why it was wrong, or why it wasn't quite right, or what fell short. As a matter of fact, I was talking to doing customer interviews for an online course that I'm developing, and the woman that I spoke with last night said, "Yeah, I've taught myself how to like manage the database and tag things and blah blah blah, but I didn't do it as well as I probably should have done. And it wasn't very elegant, or it wasn't very," and I was like, whoa, time out. You just did this thing that like completely outside of necessarily the realms of your position and your job description. You taught yourself how to do it. First of all, you recognized that it needed to be done. You taught yourself how to do it, figured out how to do it, and you implemented it. Like, why is there no like praise, or why is the praise so short-lived, right? But I feel like in a lot of ways, again, this is actually a learned response. This is a developed response. In the same way that I put on my armor, the armor of knowledge and science, so that people won't question me as a woman and as a woman of color, that people put on the armor of self-criticism to keep other people from criticizing them, right? I know I do it all the time. You criticize yourself first, then it takes away the sting if other people come in. Oh, no, I already thought of that. I should have been like this, this, and this. And you don't even need to say it. I already know.
I'm even thinking, though, about the little trained behaviors that we can all start to change straight away. Like you go order a coffee from somewhere, and that we all know that friend that says it's too hot, it's too cold, there's too much milk, there's not enough espresso, I needed more syrup, less syrup, whatever it might be. But they always have a reason as to why what they're holding in their hands and what they're sipping at is something wrong. Or you go to a restaurant, and the first thing that they pick up is, the music's too loud, the chairs are too close together, there is, something going on here that is amiss and awry. These are some of the little social injustices that I believe that we can all decide need to stop at times. And if we practice ourselves calling out the injustices in those micro areas, we might train the behavior that when we catch a criticism showing up in a bigger, more meaningful, more hurtful area of life, we've gained the confidence to be able to stand up and say, that's not how it is. And I guess we can all do a better job of acknowledging the good in a scenario without needing to put it in a context or trying to hold some form of that's good for a whatever. is if we want it to be a level playing field, let's just judge things on the positives that exist regardless of circumstance.
Because it is intrinsically good. A good talk, a good speech is a good speech, whether it's done by you or whether it's done by me or whether it's done by, somebody else of a different ethnicity or somebody who's gay or whatever. It was a great talk.
Mm-hmm.
Full stop. There doesn't need to be any qualifier with it. Maybe it's the being aware of the qualifiers and removing the qualifiers, right? Because the qualifiers is a yes but instead of a yes and.
I know you can't do this fairly because you don't know across the board comprehensively, but if you were to assume as to what could be some of the statements and thought processes that would be showing up as the inner critic in a vast majority of black women between the age of 10 and 50 years of age today, what are some of the things that would be echoing around in their head that would fall under that category of inner critic based on what they've been conditioned to believe?
Oh, that is an outstanding question. So in my book, just as a kind of person, and this is actually what I'm kind of falling back on, I have a series of inner critic mad libs. And so things like, I can't X because X, right?
Yep.
So that would actually be kind of a great place to start. Like, I can't be president because I'm a black woman.
Right.
I can't I can't actually express my true anger about something because if I do, I'll be pegged as an angry black woman. I have to work harder than everybody else just to get the same amount of recognition as, let's say, an average white guy. I have to prove to people that I'm not like those other black people. And this also, could be said to be true for black men as well. I can't be honest about how I feel about something for fear of threatening somebody else, for making them feel uncomfortable. I have to suppress or swallow my feelings so that other people, so white people, can be more comfortable.
Now, we've just scratched at the surface of the quantity of those kind of statements that could be echoing around in somebody's head. And I want anybody listening in on this right now to ask yourself, have you had that quantity of negative self-talk showing up in your world? And if not, understand that the truth in that may well be that you now don't have the empathy to understand what it's like to be someone else. And in saying that is, what can we do collectively to be able to re-educate some of those voices to change those can'ts into cans through truly empowering opportunity? Mm-hmm. And if you in any way lead an organization, I want you to understand something else that's true. Is if you have people that are part of your organization that aren't putting their whole selves forward because of these voices that are happening inside in their head, how much of their brilliance are you missing out on uncovering in the potential that they could bring towards your cause if they had the confidence to be able to bring their best self towards it? Mm-hmm. And we all have to be able to raise our level of consciousness to be able to say, these are the conversations that are happening in other people's heads. And I didn't ask you to think too hard about that, Denise. And I put you on the spot to be able to come up with it. I'm pretty sure that if we asked a giant subsection of that group of people we identified a second ago how many times they've told themselves any of those things, I think the majority of people will say more than once.
Oh, gotcha. And actually, may I share a story? Another criticism or another thought that is often is there and isn't even really that conscious is, I don't know if I can trust this person, or I don't know how much I can trust this person.
Wow.
I was in in high school, I was in a summer program, was called Horizons of Medicine. It was targeted to get minorities, students, minorities, I'll say, because, you know, that's a whole nother topic of conversation, but into the medical profession, to be doctors, nurses, other things. And my chemistry teacher was really, really gung-ho on having me get into this program, even though I wasn't actually, I didn't feel like I was that good at chemistry or any of that stuff. She was like, it'd be perfect, you should need to do it, it's gonna be great. So I did it, and I ended up becoming friends with, incidentally, her stepson, this other girl who was a white girl, and then this other guy who ended up incidentally just, kind of being half Japanese and half Caucasian. And we were kind of like a little crew. And then there was like the rest of the kids in the program, a lot of African-American kids, couple of like people of Indian descent, and anything. So nice little hodgepodge of folks. It was a program in the summer. How seriously do you want to be doing like chemistry and biochemistry and stuff like that in the summer? Anyway, one day, some of the other kids were like just being it was summertime. They were just being kind of raucous and, you know, talking and laughing and stuff like that. And me and my friend Kelly were walking out to our cars, and she was just like, oh man, I can't believe like how noisy and loud they were today. They were so, I mean, sometimes they're so annoying. And I was like, yeah, they were really feeling it today. And she was like, I mean, they're just a bunch of N-word. And then she stops and she looks at me, and like my whole body just froze.
Yeah.
And then she was like, oh, I'm not you, not like you. Like you're not like them. You're different from them. I mean, that's just, and this is a person who had like literally like me and her and Derek and John had like a dinner party at my house, and we like made like, you know, shrimp cocktail and hung out and talked, and we were like hanging out and having lunch together all the time. And then like that happens, and it's like, I considered you a friend, and now I don't know if I can trust you. And then how many other people do I know who in a moment of, you know, security would actually say something like that to me? Oh, but I'm not like those other people. It's almost like I'm white, so it's okay. And think about, I know that is not an unusual experience. I know other people have had experiences like that. Think about going through your life not knowing who you can trust, not knowing when something like that is going to come out of nowhere, not knowing when your boyfriend says, oh, I don't think of you as Black, I just think of you as Denise. And like living like that all the time.
Yeah, it's a lot.
A lot, isn't it?
It's a lot. Thank you for sharing that.
You're welcome.
Thank you. So what we're realizing is there is a lot of criticism, both external and internal.
Yeah.
The one that probably is having the most impact is the inner critic. Yet what's happening is our external criticism is amplifying the voice of the inner critic.
Yes.
Resulting in the inner critic, meaning that a giant group of people that could be bringing an even more positive contribution to society are being silenced because they feel like they've got a gagging order on them.
Pretty much.
Okay.
Yep.
And as you know about my work, one thing that I'm particularly passionate about is the power of words.
Absolutely.
And I think the rally cry that I would have to everybody listening in right now is, how much are we choosing our words when it comes to criticizing? And are we a part of the problem or are we a part of the solution, knowing that there is no position of neutral?
Mm-hmm.
And I guess the quickest antidote we can start to make a dent at on this is to replace criticism with genuine praise. But the praise has to be genuine. It has to be sincere.
Mm-hmm.
And what I'm learning from some of these interviews, Denise, and I'd love your take on this, is if you provide praise in a way that is delivered like you are doing the other person a favor, that is not praise. That is suppression.
And manipulation.
Okay. Even more than suppression.
Right? It's manipulation, because then it's conditional. It's kind of like unconditional love versus conditional love, right? I'm going to tell you this, but I'm going to tell you this, and now you owe me.
Mm-hmm. So we don't want to be criticized. We do want to be praised. Help us understand this from your point of view. How do you want leaders of organizations, meeting planners at events, audiences at events, people on Amazon judging your books, Joe Public on the street, how do you want them to not criticize but praise? What specifically can they do to change this rhetoric of conversation?
Well, I mean, I kind of feel like, everything that we need to know about being good to people we learned in kindergarten. And that, like, first of all, you need to understand, like, and I said this earlier, everybody knows what it feels like to have somebody say something good to them.
Mm-hmm.
And you know what that feels like. You know exactly how it feels in your body. You know what kind of response you have to that. You know what you want to hear. So, and that's why I think is the power of this exercise that you spoke about earlier that I do, is that if you just tell people what you would actually want to hear yourself, you're probably going to come out with the most authentic, real, true thing that you could possibly say, because you know on a visceral level what it would feel like for you to hear that. So come at people, treat people the way you would like to be treated. If you want to be respected and valued for who you are intrinsically, regardless, or maybe having like all of who you are play into that, and you want people to recognize that, then do that for other people. Yeah, we learned all this stuff in kindergarten.
Yeah, that's where you get started taught, right?
Right? I mean, it's like, this is all like you do
and figure out since kindergarten to now, who told you it was okay to not do that?
Right? And maybe we got some mixed messages in kindergarten too, but like this is like basic human stuff. Like everybody wants to have that feeling of safety, Maslow's hierarchy, right? Security, safety, belonging, community. Everybody wants that. Validation, everybody wants that. Give people what you've always wanted yourself. And I feel like it makes it easier. There's no thinking about it. There's no nothing. You don't want anybody to say to you, well, it was nice for somebody with brown hair. I mean, if he had blonde hair, it would have been like totally different.
Yeah.
If it had, if it had dreadlocks, it would have been.
Yeah, and I've had a handful of things, like, oh, I loved your accent, or I love your eyes, or things like that as the feedback for a 3-hour detailed deep dive about something that is heavily business focused, and that is not the same, right? If a painful piece of feedback to me following a program is somebody's biggest takeaway is they like the shade of my eyes, I ain't got it half bad, right? if that's me getting bad news. So I think you're so right in that let's share with people what we would like to have shared with us at that moment in time, and have the second to catch a beat and not share your opinion or think you're handing an olive branch to somebody. Instead, show up, and if you have some words of encouragement or praise, deliver them with a specificity that you feel confident the other person is going to receive as they should have done, where you're not ever going to have to back it up with, well, what I meant was.
Right.
If you're ever at risk of needing to say what I really meant was, then the chances are that you are approaching this with a hidden piece of criticism as opposed to a genuine compliment.
Absolutely.
2 questions, Denise, that I've been asking of everybody on this season, and I want to make sure I get the time to be able to ask of you. They're words-related questions. You know words are my thing, and I'm going to be looking for a single word from you twice that is an adjective that describes something that's happening in your world right now. And the first adjective that I'm looking for is if you were to reach for a word that describes how you're feeling at this moment in time about how everything's happening at this moment in time, what word might you use to be able to describe how you're feeling?
Actually, the first word that came to me was, well, one of the first words. There were 3 words that came to me. Hopeful is actually how I feel.
Okay.
I feel hopeful that this will actually be the beginning of long-lasting change.
Okay. Final question in the interview is another word that I'm searching for from you. Is if we're to think forward 12, 18, 24, 36 months on from now, and that the world is a version of different that you dream, what might be an adjective to describe the difference that exists in that world that isn't in place today?
Equitable.
Okay. And what is the difference between equitable and equality?
Well, first of all, equality is a noun. And you asked for an adjective.
But I'm just thinking that there's a lot of misconception about those 2 words, and I wanted to just take the opportunity to say, can we just clean up that mess?
Yeah. So no, and I was just joking.
And you're right.
But I would say that equitable is like it has the capacity or the quality of equality. But instead of equality, almost sounds like it is something that's there and that's established and that's unmoving. Whereas equitable to me feels more like it is a process and it is it's an active process. It's an active choice. It's more about action rather than something that's established, that's come and that's there and then that's established. So
with the very simplistic of examples of being that if you run an organization and you have a belief that you want to be able to serve a diverse group of customers and your boardroom has 17 white males on it and 1 token female, then you would become more equitable if what you did is you consciously shifted that balance to say that actually let's have a voice around that table for every group of people that we are looking to be able to actually serve as an organization, and include those voices and give them the respect of being able to own that voice. Don't put them there for the sake of the fact that you should have done.
Exactly. So equitable is about action.
Okay.
Right? Action, taking steps, and actually deliberate and intentional.
So recognizing an imbalance and then taking a step to be able to actually improve that.
And yep, intentionally. Yep.
Okay. Denise, thank you so much for providing part of yourself, part of your day, much of your soul into this interview. It really is highly, highly appreciated from my point of view, and no doubt same from many of the people listening in. If people want to continue the conversation with you, find out more about you, where shall we send them?
So my website is denisejacobs.com. If you want to send me an email, you can go to denise@denisejacobs.com. Please follow me on Twitter and Instagram. My handle is Denise Jacobs. On Facebook, it's denisejacobs.com, all written out. And please do connect with me on LinkedIn. It's Denise R. Jacobs on LinkedIn. And also, please do look up, I am a LinkedIn learning author, and I have 3 courses on LinkedIn right now. One is the Banish Your Inner Critic course that's based on my book. Another one is on creative collaboration. And then the final one is Creativity for All, Hacking the Creative Brain. So how you can get your brain into a more creative space. And then please also go to Amazon.com and buy my book, Banish Your Inner Critic.
It's a great read. I've enjoyed it a number of times and recommended it to others. So Denise, thank you so much for being here. I appreciate all that you do in the world and look forward to hanging out, catching up again sometime soon in person. And we can get you one of those fantastic non-alcoholic cocktails of yours.
Excellent. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Bill.